Testing 1 2 1 2. Testing 1 2 1 2. Geezy Truth News. Brought to you by Sadar. On standby. Introducing Jim Fetzer! Oh man. Cue in. Jeezy live. Testing 1 2 1 2. Testing 1 2 1 2. Uh-oh. We got technical difficulties. T-minus 5 seconds.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello, and welcome to Geezy Truth News. Yeah, if you'd like. It depends on whatever you want. We could do video, or we could just do talk.
How you do? With me, but you need your camera. It's looking at the ceiling. Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah.
All right. We set you up on screen. So how are you doing, Mr.
Good,
Jim
fine,
Fetzer?
Good.
Well, I don't know if you wanted to talk about your personal stuff first and then get on with all the politics and worldly stuff, but if you wanted to talk about what's going on with the court.
Your camera's just looking at your wall.
Yeah, it looks like that to you, but on screen it shows your face.
Oh, my face. Oh, I see.
I'll show you.
I'll see you. Is that it?
Yeah, I'll send you the video afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. So you want to give a countdown or begin or what?
Yeah, we can start right now.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in to Geezy Truth News and featuring Jim Fetzer. And we're going to be talking about his personal court stuff, what's going on in what's been happening recently, and then onto the world politics and impeachment and all the crazy stuff that's going on. So go ahead and begin, Jim Fetzer.
Well, actually, there's a remarkable parallel. I've been reflecting on it for a couple of weeks now between the impeachment of Donald Trump, these hearings being run by the Democrats, which are completely fabricated. They have no foundation in fact. I have read the transcript of the conversation. I'm very familiar with the circumstances. Joe Biden himself has actually acknowledged on video having threatened to withhold $1 billion in foreign aid from the Ukrainians unless they fired the prosecutor who was looking into corruption with Burisma, where his son Hunter Biden was on the board in spite of a complete absence of any discernible qualifications. He certainly knows nothing about the gas or oil industry, yet he was getting $20,000 a month on that order. Vast. In fact, it turns out now that Ukraine itself just reported today, has launched an investigation into Burisma, and its chief executive officer has been indicted for corruption, which reinforces the president's concerns that Ukraine is a very corrupt country. He wasn't seeking the so-called quid pro quo. In fact, even this Ambassador Sondland admitted very late in his testimony that during his conversations with the president, Sondland asked him what he wanted from Ukraine, and the president explained he didn't want anything, that there was no quid pro quo, and I'm convinced that that is indeed the case. Now, the parallel is this. Trump did nothing wrong, and in my case, I did nothing wrong. I published a book bringing together 13 experts about Sandy Hook entitled Nobody Died at Sandy Hook. Included among the experts are 6 current or retired PhD professors. We established that the school had been closed by 2008, that there were no students there, and that it was a FEMA exercise presented as mass murder to promote gun control, the Obama administration's political agenda. Indeed, a month and 2 days later, on the 16th of January, Barack Obama signed no less than 23 executive orders to constrain our access to weapons under the Second Amendment, largely with a political cover presented by the completely staged, fake, phony shooting at Sandy Hook. In fact, the latest reports I have, and I'm in the process of confirming them, is that the major news networks began showing up on the 12th and the 13th. They were there in advance because they knew there was going to be a big story for them to cover. We obviously have massive proof that this was indeed a FEMA drill. We even have the manual, which I included in the book as Appendix A. There's a reason why Amazon banned the book less than a month after it went on sale on 22 October 2015, even though it had sold nearly 500 copies. It was banned on the 19th of November. It was such a blatantly political act, having been produced by CreateSpace, which is a subsidiary of Amazon.com itself, that it was obvious it didn't violate any of the standards of Amazon. Indeed, at that point in time, Amazon had 20 books on Sandy Hook, mine being the only one that contested the official account. But the fact is, what we established was so solid, the proof was so stunning, it was so overwhelming, detailed, and meticulous, they had to suppress it. So they banned the book. Recognizing what was taking place was a political act, I immediately released the book for free as a PDF. Now, tremendous efforts have been undertaken to try to suppress public access to the book itself, but in fact, the research that we published in that book in 2015, and then with certain minor revisions, but a change and supplementation of additional chapters in 2016, has stood up very well, where the most recent research effort to assess what took place at Sandy Hook was published by Robert David Steele on his blog in a Sandy Hook memorandum series for the President of the United States. It's 132 pages long. It has contributions from about 30 different experts on Sandy Hook, some with more than one. Brief memoranda, only 3 or 4 pages long. So in this lawsuit, they had to find a way to skate around the massive evidence we had that it was a FEMA drill, including the manual, where events on the ground confirmed exactly what we're claiming in the book. There was a sign that said everyone must check in, which we find confirmed by the manual, which says everyone must check in with a controller upon arrival. We had porta potties already in place, pizza and bottled water available at the firehouse. Well, it's standard for FEMA exercises that they provide restrooms and refreshments. There were many who were filmed there wearing name tags on lanyards. That's exactly how FEMA identifies the players with color-coded name tags on lanyards. So all of this was consistent. Not only that, but they had parents bringing children to the scene. I'm sure you would agree. No parent is going to bring their child to the scene of a child shooting massacre. But because this was the rehearsal, they were treating it as a festive occasion. Indeed, some of the participants became confused about the dates and put up donation web pages already on the 13th. Even Adam Lanza, the purported shooter, was listed originally in the Social Security Death Index as having died on the 13th, making his feat in shooting 20 children and 6 adults the following day all the more remarkable. The day of the shooting, there were additional anomalies that confirmed this was a drill, not a real emergency. No surge of EMTs into the building, no string of ambulances to rush their little bodies off to hospitals where they could be declared to be dead or alive. No medevac helicopter was called. They put out triage tarps, but no bodies, dead or wounded, were ever placed on them. And moreover, when the medical examiner Wayne Carver gave his press conference the following day, he explained the parents had not been allowed to view the bodies of their children, but they were identified on the basis of photographs, which we know now was very appropriate because they faked the kids using photographs of older kids when they were younger. Indeed, Mona Alexis Presley, who's done brilliant work on Sandy Hook and also on Las Vegas, tracking down the alleged decedents of Las Vegas, discovering to the extent to which they weren't merely Photoshop variations on one another, they represented persons who died in different states or on different dates or from different causes of death. So we have a surge. We've been unleashed, these phony shooting episodes by Barack Obama, who nullified the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, which had precluded the use within the domestic United States of the same techniques of propaganda and disinformation that were being used abroad. By the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012, just in time to bring us Sandy Hook, followed in relatively short order by the Boston bombing, and by Orlando and Dallas, and by Charlottesville, and Parkland, and Las Vegas. I've done massive collaborative research on all of the above. I have books already published on most of them, which, believe it or not, Amazon has now banned. Of the 12 books we have published at moonrockbooks.com, Amazon has banned 6. This is simply astonishing. It must be the new indoor record. They have banished the book on Sandy Hook, as you know, which I released for free, and as a PDF. And if you go to Robert David Steele's website, track down his Sandy Hook POTUS for President of the United States memoranda, and where you can download the POTUS memorandum series of 2018, which you'll discover confirms all of the claims we made in our previous research and adds additional details heretofore unknown, but also supporting the thesis that indeed this was a FEMA exercise where nobody died. You can also download the book and each of its chapters individually as a PDF, all for free. So you want to go to your browser, put in Robert David Steele, go to his website, then look for SH-POTUS, that's the Sandy Hook POTUS memoranda, and when you find the page, you can scroll down and you'll find you have access to the book as well. Now, Donald Trump is being framed over this Ukraine deal. It's quite obvious to those of us who have followed this closely that it's simply Russiagate 2.0. I actually have a book exposing the Russia hoax that's available on Lulu, L-U-L-U. It's very inexpensive. It's only 132 pages itself, and you can pick it up on the cheap at Lulu. It may or may not be available at Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com, but Amazon has obviously gone after me, hammers and tong, completely despicable, reminiscent of the book banning of the past. The idea that Amazon should be censoring books and deciding what Americans are entitled to read or not read, just as YouTube is censoring what Americans can watch or not watch, is appalling. I strongly suspect, by the way, that the plaintiff in my case, who calls himself Leonard Posner, as the purported son, father of one of the deceased kids at Sandy Hook, Noah Posner, reportedly the youngest of the children who were shot there, turns out to be some kind of internet genius. He's been using the so-called Honor, H-O-N-R network in order to go after, censor, and take down not only research on Sandy Hook, but on virtually every of the other controversial events, which were likewise staged. And I strongly suspect he was behind the banning of the book in the beginning. What I want to add, and give you a chance to work a few words or questions in edgewise, is there's so many parallels with Donald Trump, because during the course of my hearing, during the course of my case, which I entered in the anticipation I'd be able to present all the evidence I've already described to you and much more, that this was a FEMA exercise presented as mass murder to promote gun control, from which it follows that any death certificates for alleged decedents would have to be fabrications, where indeed I was being sued over the declaration that a death certificate that Leonard Posner had given to my research colleague Kelly Watt in 2014, which we published in the book, and which I declared to be a fabrication on the basis of multiple grounds, including it had no file number, it had the wrong estimated time of death at 11 a.m. when the shooting officially took place between 9:30 and 9:40. It had no town certification. It had no state certification. And well, a couple of the dozen reasons I gave for concluding it was a fabrication were mistaken. I was correct in my assessment that the document is a fabrication, which is evident, self-evident, from observing that it's not even a complete death certificate. Obviously, an incomplete document cannot qualify as an authentic death certificate, and indeed it turns out in Connecticut that not even parents are allowed to have possession of a non-certified and uncertified death certificate, of which this was a sterling example. Now, what's going on in the impeachment hearings, that the judge, in my case, precluded me from introducing any of that evidence and restricted the focus exclusively to the authenticity of the death certificate. There were motions by both parties for summary judgment. These are dispositive rulings by the court, which can be exercised by a judge only if there are no disputed facts. But the authenticity of the death certificate, which was a crucial question, remained in dispute. Not only did I advance all the reasons I've given here, but I also secured reports from two forensic document examiners who not only agreed that the death certificate was a fabrication, but that three other versions of the death certificate for Noah Posner that surfaced during the case were also fabrications, which means that the court could not have legitimately issued a summary judgment because the facts were in dispute. Indeed, as I understand the protocols that govern summary judgments, in order to make a summary judgment, he had to assume, hypothetically, that every claim I made about the case was true for the sake of rendering his ruling solely on the basis of the law, which he clearly did not do. He basically set all my evidence aside, and during the summary judgment hearing even explained to the counsel for the plaintiff, where I was representing myself pro se, having been unable to secure legal representation in spite of a diligent search, no doubt because the case is such a hot potato. He explained to the counsel for the plaintiff that if he struck the reports of the expert document examiners, that would be a basis for appeal, and therefore he wasn't going to strike them. He was merely going to set them aside as somebody else's opinion. But when I had two document experts affirming this was a fabricated document, indeed the others as well, and the plaintiff had none, the judge was obligated to follow the evidence I had presented and rule in my favor, not in favor of the plaintiff. I would say similarly, just as I was excluded by the judge from presenting evidence, Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, and these others in the Democratic Party have been conspiring against Trump because, as Al Green, a representative from Texas, observed, if we don't impeach this guy, he will get reelected. And indeed, there are overwhelming reasons why Trump is going to be reelected in spite of this massive onslaught that is completely corrupt, just as phony and fabricated a case against Donald Trump, as was the phony fabricated case against me right here in Dane County Circuit Court in Wisconsin. So I'm following all of this with great interest. Trump not only has done wonders for the economy, not only is unemployment in black and Latino communities at an all-time low, but American cities are the safest they've been in 50 years. In fact, experts are reporting that young people who are alive today have never, are living in the safest environment in this country they've had. The Democrats want to exclude all the evidence that violent crimes have dropped dramatically. That when you look at the aggregate for violent crimes, which includes rape and murder and kidnapping, they're all at historic lows. Plus, you won't hear it from the mainstream media, but it turns out Americans use guns for defensive purposes between 500,000, that's 500,000, and 3 million times every single year, where studies suggest that American lives are being saved to the tune of 200,000 lives every year. Well, if you added up all the deaths from these alleged phony shootings, you wouldn't even get to 200. We're talking about 200,000. So on the basis of these alleged shootings, which if you took them to be authentic would add up to a very small number of deaths, but when you understand that they're all staged, phony, and fake, you realize the whole thing is a complete charade. The Democrats are trying to bamboozle the public over gun control, over Donald Trump, and indeed over this fake impeachment effort involving Ukraine, which has no basis whatsoever. Trump, in fact, has given more support to Ukraine than did the Obama administration, including, especially notably, Javelin anti-tank missiles, which the Ukrainians had sought, but which Obama refused to provide, which would be the single weapon that would be most effective if they were to incur a Russian onslaught and invasion of Ukraine, which I don't predict or anticipate would happen at all. But where Trump has been in relation to Ukraine on the Ukrainian side, where the Ukrainian president has acknowledged he was unaware of any effort, any quid pro quo. Trump himself, as Ambassador Sunderland explained to him, wanted nothing from Ukraine, that in particular there was no quid pro quo. It's all being orchestrated by phonies, fakes, and shills, most of whom were dual U.S.-Israeli citizens, such as Adam Schiff. And it's embarrassingly bad what's going on here. It's not in the interest of the United States that Donald Trump should be impeached. It is in the interest of the deep state, where Barack Obama himself, John Brennan, Hillary Clinton, appear to have been prime movers in this effort to impeach Trump, because as Al Green observed, if we don't impeach this guy, he will get reelected. Indeed, the latest report of Marquette University poll right here in Wisconsin has shown that impeachment is having the opposite effect of what the Democrats would like, that in fact support for Trump has been increasing. Support for impeachment has been falling. Let me give you some of the data I can pull up. Very interesting. I'm also following the debates, and it's quite obvious that the Democrats don't have a candidate that could hold a candle to Donald Trump. By far, their strongest candidate is one they themselves are shunning, to wit Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, who has a great presence. She has a command of the issue. She's highly intelligent, more so than, so far as I can discern, anyone else on the stage with her. She has a non-interventionist foreign policy, very compatible with the campaign pledges of Donald Trump, and where I would like if even Donald Trump were to consider dropping Mike Pence and running with Tulsi Gabbard. Let me give you a report of how badly this whole thing is backfiring on the Democrats. Here's the headline. New Marquette Law School poll finds shifts in Wisconsin public opinion favorable to President Trump on impeachment and presidential election preferences. Now, this was just published November 21st, which is today, okay? It was dated yesterday, published today. Milwaukee, even as hearings that could lead to President Donald Trump's impeachment heat up, a new Marquette University Law School poll of Wisconsin registered voters finds consistent, if sometimes modest, shifts in public opinion away from support for impeachment and toward supporting Trump in next year's presidential election. For example, Trump holds small leads over each of the top four Democratic candidates for president in head-to-head matchups in the new survey, while three of the Democrats held small leads over Trump in the previous poll. While the shifts in opinion on both impeachment and presidential preferences are not large, they are consistent across multiple questions in the poll. That includes increases in support for Trump's work on foreign policy and the economy. The poll was conducted 13 to 17 November, so it's very recent. In the new poll, 40% of registered voters think that Trump should be impeached and removed from office, while 53% do not think so. 6% say they don't know. In October, before public hearings began, 44% favored impeachment and removal from office, while 51% were opposed and 4% said they didn't know. The November results also find 52% say they believe Trump asked the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rivals, while 29% believe Trump did not do this. 18% don't know. 41% believe Trump withheld military aid to pressure the Ukrainian president, while 38% do not believe he did. 21% don't know. 42% say Trump did something seriously wrong in his dealings with Ukraine. 9% say he did something wrong but not seriously, and 38% say Trump did nothing wrong. Once again, 8% do not know. But the fact is, all these poll results are favoring Trump. And in current matchups now, right here in Wisconsin, a state, the Democrats have to win if they're going to prevail in the 2020 election. Against Biden, Trump is ahead 47 to 44. Against Sanders, Trump is ahead 48 to 45. Against Warren, Trump is ahead 48 to 43. against Buttigieg, Trump is ahead 47 to 39. What that means is this entire impeachment business is backfiring, and indeed, in my opinion, it's going to lend to greater sympathy and support for Donald Trump, because most Americans quite rightly see this as the Democrats' ongoing effort to make amends for their loss in 2016, where they still are in disbelief that Hillary Clinton lost, even though Michael Moore, who's an extreme cheerleader for the left, predicted that Hillary was going to lose because she was neglecting the Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which proved to be prophetic. She did indeed lose, as studies by the University of Minnesota and Boston University have shown, because rural voters in those same four states voted for Trump in the belief, no doubt well-founded, that of the two alternative candidates, he was the less likely to continue the wars in the Middle East, where those counties had suffered massive losses, casualties from their own young men and women being involved in the Middle East. I thought Trump did a brilliant thing when he pulled our forces out of Syria. Had he only let it alone, I think there would have been universal applause. But by sending back in the tanks, we got this visual image of American tanks surrounding Saudi oil fields, and now the Pentagon is declaring that the U.S. forces have the right to fire on Syrian officials if they seek to retake control of Syrian oil in Syria. I mean, in my opinion, Donald Trump has misplayed his cards in the Middle East. I believe Tulsi Gabbard would be a wonderful antidote, and that if Trump were to see the situation clearly, he could create a sensation that would lead, in my opinion, to an overwhelming landslide if he were to run with Tulsi Gabbard. Mike Pence, in my opinion, has offered very little. Yes, he represents the evangelical right. That is most certainly true. But I believe the right wing is so convinced that Trump is the right guy for the job, where he continues to enjoy a 90% approval rating within the Republican Party, that there's no viable alternative to Trump for the Republicans, and they can only strengthen their ticket by a move such as I am proposing here, which would show that Trump is very open-minded, very original, by taking a candidate who's running for the Democratic nomination but being shunned by virtually every other Democrat, notwithstanding she has the only reasonable approach toward the Middle East, and has even displayed her sincerity and integrity by visiting Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who, many Americans to this day do not know, is a democratically elected president of Syria, who enjoys the support of over 80% of the Syrian people. So, you know, he's described as a murderous dictator, but the alleged events for which he has been so characterized were manufactured and faked. There's a long story that goes with it. But those are the bare bones, not only about my lawsuit, where an improper summary judgment ruling was rendered by the court, and then where a jury of a dozen young people from Madison, all under the age of 30, one man and 11 women, who claimed they'd never even heard of Alex Jones. I mean, how ludicrous is that? Decided that for defaming Leonard Posner, I was liable to the tune of $450,000, which I described then as an absurd judgment. There was never any proof even that he was aware of the sentences in the book. He's actually acknowledged he's never read the book. And frankly, the whole thing was as completely contrived, phony, and fake as the impeachment that the Democrats are running against Donald Trump, where we have some very brilliant people like Devin Nunes, Jim Jordan, and others who are exposing the chicanery by the Democrats. I think this is going to play out in favor of Donald Trump. They have adjourned the hearings now. They will not convene until the 3rd of December after the Thanksgiving break. And you can bet the Democrats are going back to their district to see how this impeachment hearing is going over with the people. Frankly, the people are tired. They're worn out. They see through it. They know this is fake. They know it's phony. And they believe the right time to settle accounts with Donald Trump is during the election of 2020, not during this impeachment hearing. So do not be surprised if the Democrats return to Congress on the 3rd of December in a much more sober mood and decide to minimize or even abandon the impeachment effort here, because it's doing them great harm, and if they continue to do so, to pursue it will do even greater harm in the future.
Yeah, wow. Well, that was packed in a lot. There's a lot of information packed in there. You're absolutely correct about most stuff there, Jim. And what can I tell you? That's pretty much what's the next step on the court case?
Well, the court case becomes final on the 12th of December. That's when all the loose ends have to be tied up. My attorney, and I'm happy to say I was able to secure a very talented attorney after the summary judgment hearing, who is very experienced with the appellate court and who has submitted 4 or more motions that the court has to rule upon on the 12th of December, including the observation that the verdict that I was liable for defamation is in violation of Wisconsin law, which holds that you cannot have a ruling of liability without finding fault. In other words, I have to have done something wrong. As you can no doubt discern from everything I've already explained, I did nothing wrong. The statements I made describing the death certificate as a fabrication were accurate and true. Truth is an absolute defense in defamation. The plaintiffs had originally charged me with malice, that I deliberately, knowing what I was asserting was false, nevertheless asserted it anyway in order to target the plaintiff, which is completely absurd. All we were doing was trying to sort out all the evidence to figure out what happened at Sandy Hook. I was never targeting Leonard Posner, though I most certainly have amassed voluminous evidence that this man is a creature. He's the tip of the spear for internet censorship. He has acknowledged being responsible for removing 1,555 videos from YouTube during another interview with a false flag guy, a guy in Berlin interviewing him that Ole Damagard has identified as being involved in several staged events in Europe. He boasted that he had been responsible for the removal of tens of thousands of content items from the internet. So that this guy really is the vanguard of censorship. I make the point, by the way, that the witness they had in a video deposition, who was affirming that although he had never actually met Leonard Posner, but diagnosed him based upon a 1-hour phone call, was given claims about me that were false by the plaintiff's attorney and by the plaintiff himself, including that I had harassed him, which I have never done, that I had spoken with him on the telephone, which I have never done, that I had accused him of fabricating the death certificate, which I also had not done. I only maintained the death certificate as a fabrication, not that he himself had fabricated it. And they said, denied he had a son, where that, of course, is much more elaborate, because my dear colleague Kelly Watt, the same who had received the death certificate from Leonard Posner we published and discussed in the book had noticed striking similarities in the appearance of the young Noah Posner and a fellow named Michael Vabner, who is supposed to be his older stepbrother, so that in pursuit of Kelly's conjecture, 6 of us went to work on this issue. We found they had the same eyes, they had the same eyebrows, they had the same nose, they had the same mouth, they had the same ears, they had the same shape of skull. So to verify what was already apparent, namely that indeed Noah Posner was a fiction made up out of photographs of his older stepbrother Michael Vabner as a child, I asked a colleague of mine from JFK Research, Larry Rivero, who had done completely brilliant work in confirming the results of collaborative research that Lee Oswald had been captured in a very famous photograph taken during the assassination by AP photographer James Ike Alchins, where there's a figure peering out from the doorway of the book depository that looked strikingly like Lee Oswald, where on the basis of comparisons of their height, their weight, their build, their shirt, and their t-shirt, we had identified this as having been Lee Oswald based on the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt Lee Oswald was wearing when he was arrested. Indeed, even Harold Weisberg in his famous Whitewash series had already published in the 2nd volume of that series, also known as Photographic Whitewash, in the last few pages, that the Warren Commission staff was having a terrible time concealing the fact that Lee Oswald had been in the doorway of the book depository at the time of the shooting, which of course means he not only cannot have been the lone demented gunman, he cannot have even been one of the shooters. So Larry found photographs from a similar perspective. He has mastered the principles of photogrammetry, which is the application of mathematics to the study of photographs. And it turns out if you have 2 photographs from the same perspective, if you set the distance between the pupils of the eyes the same, then if it's the same person, all the other features will coincide. He had done that with photographs of Lee Oswald and of Billy Lovelady, whom the government claims was the man in the doorway, where Billy himself had said he thought was very odd they'd be confused because he was 2 to 3 inches shorter, 15 to 20 pounds heavier, and in fact, on the day of the shooting had been wearing a short-sleeved red and white vertically striped shirt, completely different than the long-sleeved, richly textured shirt that was worn by the man in the doorway, where Billy had been called in by the FBI on the 29th of February, 1964, asked to wear the same shirt he'd been wearing, and they took photographs of him wearing the short-sleeved red and white vertically striped shirt, which you can find in the report they sent to J. Edgar Hoover, confirming that Billy Lovelady had come in and had been photographed wearing the same shirt he'd been wearing the day of the assassination. Completely different. But where Larry took the argument to yet another level by doing a superposition of the image of Lee Oswald on the features of the man in the doorway and created a GIF where you can see the man in the doorway turn into Lee Oswald, all the features coincide. And similarly for Billy Lovelady, where you can see the GIF where the man in the doorway does not turn into Billy Lovelady because the ears are too low, the jaw is wrong, the nose doesn't fit. They're obviously not the same person. That it was indeed Lee Oswald in the doorway with all the ramifications that entailed. So, recognizing Larry to be an expert, I sent him a photograph of Noah Posner and a photograph of Michael Vabner, unidentified. These were just 2 persons. Larry knew nothing of the context. He had no idea it had anything to do with Sandy Hook. I asked him, are they the same person? And he worked his magic and created a GIF where you can see Noah Posner turn into Michael Vabner. Without any question, they are one and the same person. And you can see the GIF if you go onto my blog at jamesfetzer.org, where I have a very large number of individual blogs about Sandy Hook, some of which include The Give, where you see Noah turn into Michael Wagner, none of which was I allowed to present by the court. In other words, just as Adam Schiff has not allowed the Republicans to present their evidence in defense of Donald Trump, the judge in my case would not allow me to present my evidence in defense of this completely fabricated allegation against me. So on the 12th, the judge will make rulings where, among the 4 motions that my attorney has submitted on my behalf, he makes a point that the summary judgment was not proper because proof had not been established that I had done anything wrong. In other words, they never showed that I had been negligent in arriving at the conclusion that the death certificate was a fabrication. Indeed, one of the 2 document examiners in my case had observed that in his opinion, as an expert, anyone looking at the features of the document that I was describing in the book, the absence of the file number, the wrong estimated time of death, the lack of the town certification, the lack of the state certification, and other features I there described, would have reasonably concluded that this death certificate was a fabrication. And indeed, as I've already explained, given Connecticut law, given the 2 document examiners' reports, I was in fact correct, but Wisconsin statutes make it very clear that there can be no liability without fault. In other words, for me to be liable, they had to find I was at fault. And what they would have to do, which they did not do, is to show I was negligent in arriving at the conclusion that this death certificate was a fabrication, which the second of the 2 document examiners contradicted by suggesting any reasonable person looking at the document and the features I noted would have reasonably concluded that it was a fabrication, which means they're not going to be able to show I was negligent. So that if the court is appropriately responsive to this motion, only 1 of 4 he submitted, then he ought to reconsider, have to go back and reopen the summary judgment hearing, which was improperly decided. I've also learned, by the way, from other legal experts that in rendering the summary judgment, the court has to accept all of my protestations, all of my assertions in my defense as though they were true for the sake of rendering the summary judgment. By assuming they're all true, it shows, if indeed it is the case there are no disputed facts, which is of course not the case here, that his decision is purely based on the law. In fact, he ignored the fact that my protestations, my assertions, if you acknowledge them to be true, meant the summary judgment ought to have been rendered on my behalf, not on behalf of the plaintiff. So the case will not be final until the 12th of December. Depending upon the judge's rulings, I may or may not get a reconsideration of the summary judgment. More likely, he will deny the motions, and at that point I'll be entitled to a review by the appellate court here in Wisconsin. And as I am explaining, my attorney is a very experienced appellate court attorney. Let me suggest, by the way, given today is 21 November, given tomorrow is the 22nd of November, the 57th observance, the 56th observance, the shooting, of course, took place in 1963, and this is 2019. So we're talking about the 56th observance of the assassination of JFK, on which I have published 4 different collections of expert studies. If it's agreeable to you, I'd be glad to explain to the audience what happened to JFK, who was responsible and why.
Oh, of course. That sounds great.
Well, we're talking about the world's greatest murder mystery. It was extremely complex and convoluted. If you accepted the Warren Commission report, you'd assume it was simple, cut and dry. 3 lucky shots by a disgruntled former Marine firing from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But, as you already know, it was totally fabricated. The story was a false narrative. It was a myth. It had no basis in fact, because Lee Oswald was actually standing in the doorway of the Texas School Book Depository when the shooting took place, and therefore not only cannot have been the lone demonic gunman, but one of the shooters, where only Domagard and I have identified 6 of the shooters, only a 7th, and where there's yet an 8th shooter, whose identity at this point in time remains unknown. I'll return to that point. To get the big picture about JFK, you have to draw distinctions between the sponsors, the individuals or groups who wanted JFK out, and LBJ in, primarily on the basis of policy differences, the facilitators who made it happen, and the mechanics, the shooters and their supervisors on the ground. Now the sponsors, the individuals and groups who wanted JFK out, included the CIA. Jack had threatened to shatter the agency into 1,000 pieces. They were not happy about that, and were not about to relinquish their power. The Joint Chiefs, surprisingly enough, were very unhappy with Jack because he had was refusing to get our troops into Vietnam. He was already pulling them out. He'd signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union against their unanimous opposition and had refused to invade Cuba, even though they were recommending that move be made. So for Jack, with the Chiefs, it was 3 strikes and you're out, and they signed on with the CIA. In addition, you had the anti-Castro Cubans who believed that JFK had betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs. It's not true. It was the CIA who mucked up. It turns out that the date of the invasion had been learned by the Soviet Union, which they had shared with Fidel Castro, so that Castro knew the date and location where we were about to invade Cuba. The Soviets knew, the CIA knew that Castro and the Soviets knew, but they did not inform the commander-in-chief. That by itself was a colossal act of treason, for undoubtedly had JFK known that Castro knew we were coming, he would have called it off and avoided the fiasco that has come to be known as the Bay of Pigs. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed was upset with Jack because he had published United States notes on the ground that it was absurd to allow a consortium of private banks to publish the currency of the United States at interest, when the Department of the Treasury could publish United States notes at no interest for the benefit of the American people. I recall, as a young Marine Corps officer holding one of these bills in my hand, it had a red embossed imprint. It said United States note instead of a green embossed imprint, Federal Reserve note. And may I add, for emphasis, the staggering national debt. It is because of compound interest on having this private consortium of banks print the currency of the United States. It has been observed on more than one occasion that the greatest evil ever designed by the mind of man is compound interest. So that staggering national debt really is money purportedly owed to the Federal Reserve, which is not a federal organization. It is not a reserve, but a consortium of private banks. where it appears that Jack was going to circumvent or even shut it down. In addition, you had the Texas oilmen who were alarmed because Jack was threatening to cut the oil depletion allowance. It was a massive tax write-off they had on the ground that oil was a finite resource, and therefore by pumping it out of the ground, they were putting themselves out of business. Ludicrous, but a very real, tangible benefit. And then, in addition, Israel. Jack had been at loggerheads with David Ben-Gurion, a founder and first prime minister of Israel, over Ben-Gurion's desire that Israel develop nuclear weapons, in particular at Dimona, a facility they would not allow the world to inspect. Jack was very insistent that the Israelis not develop nuclear weapons, lest it unleash a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Ben-Gurion actually resigned in disgust, but after, it appears, committing the Mossad to participate in the assassination of the president. Jack was lured to Dallas by Lyndon Johnson, who was a pivotal player in the entire event. To get the proper historical perspective, you have to go back to the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 1960, where Lyndon Johnson was running against Jack Kennedy for the Democratic nomination, where John Connally was Lyndon's campaign manager. Jack, of course, prevailed. And he extended the invitation to be his running mate to Stuart Symington of Missouri, but gave Symington overnight to think about it. Meanwhile, Bobby went by the Johnson suite to extend a pro forma invitation as running mate, a symbolic gesture, and was simply dumbfounded when Lyndon jumped on it. No one would have ever imagined he would give up his position as the powerful majority leader of the Senate to run for the vice president, which has been described as a position worth no more than a bucket of warm, you've heard it said, spit, but the actual phrase is a bucket of warm pits. That the vice presidency isn't worth more than a bucket of warm pits. That's the actual phrase. Bobby was just floored, but Lyndon was insistent. He threatened to reveal that Jack suffered from Addison's disease, which was true, which meant he wasn't going to live a long, healthy life, and that among his many dalliances, at least one was with a beautiful woman who was a spy for East Germany, and that was information he'd received from J. Edgar Hoover, who, like Lyndon, hated the Kennedys. And moreover, he explained that if he were not on the ticket, that any legislative proposals coming from the White House would be dead on arrival, because in his position as a powerful majority leader, which of course he'd retained, were he not the vice president of the United States, and he even arranged in Texas that he could run simultaneously to be reelected as senator and for vice president of the United States. He would bottle them up and they'd be dead on arrival. So Bobby and Jack were boxed in by LBJ. And anyone who has any doubt about Lyndon's psychopathic personality must read the brilliant book by Phil Nelson entitled LBJ, Mastermind of JFK's Assassination. Completely brilliant. You won't be able to read more than a few chapters, and you'll be convinced that this man was completely ruthless, had no scruples, no morals, no ethics whatsoever, and would not tolerate any opposition in obtaining or securing his goals. Indeed, as I shall explain, one of the shooters in Dealey Plaza was Malcolm Mack Wallace, who was Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman, who had murdered a dozen people for Lyndon, including one of his own sisters. So Jack and Bobby had to accede to Lyndon's demands. When one of LBJ's wealthy backers learned what was taking place. He burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing that now Lyndon was going to help JFK become president. Bobby took Baker, who was LBJ's bagman. He collected the money for him as the Senate Majority Leader, took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later declare in public that Lyndon Johnson, that Jack Kennedy would not survive his first term in office and that he would die a violent death. Lyndon was in the perfect position as the vice president to coordinate the effort that would take place. He was, of course, tight with the Texas oilmen, in contact with the Joint Chiefs, dealing with the CIA. He was very familiar with the anti-Castro Cubans. He would go to the White House and schmooze with the Secret Service, many of whom were resentful of JFK on various counts. I have, in my own research, discovered more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit, including leaving behind 2 Secret Service agents at Love Field who would have run beside the presidential limousine or ridden on the back. They were left behind at Love Field, putting the vehicles in the motorcade in the wrong order, where the presidential limo should have been in the middle, preceded by the lower-ranking dignitaries such as the mayor and the vice president. After all, if you come to see Jack and Jackie, why would you stick around for the mayor of Dallas or the vice president? Putting that vehicle out front so it would be easier for the multiple shooters to identify their target. Jackie was given a huge bouquet of red roses to identify her location, whereas Nellie Conley, sitting in front of Jackie, had a huge bouquet of yellow roses, where John Conley was sitting in the jump seat in front of Jack in the back right. And then the vehicle was driven by William Greer, who was a substitute driver, and Roy Kellerman was the agent in charge in the passenger seat. Now, this motorcade, unlike any other presidential motorcade, included vehicles of all different makes, models, and colors, so they could identify exactly who was where in the motorcade. Indeed, the president's personal physician was put in the very last vehicle to make it maximally difficult for him to reach the president should an emergency arise. Indeed, in addition, his military aide, who would normally have ridden in the front seat in between the driver Greer and Roy Kellerman, was moved to that final vehicle as well, for what turned out to be the excellent reason they were going to fire a shot through the windshield. And had he been in his normal position, he, rather than Jack, would have been hit. In addition, they canceled the flatbed truck that would have carried the news people and their cameras immediately preceding the Secret Service, the presidential limousine. They didn't weld the manhole covers. They didn't ensure the open windows along the motorcade route were closed. They cut down the motor vehicle escort to 4 and gave them instructions of not to ride forward on the rear wheels, which one of the officers said was the damnedest formation he'd ever heard. They set up Jack for the assassination. That was the role of the Secret Service, completely disgusting. After the event, they forcibly stole the body from Parkland Hospital, where by Texas law, since the only offense that had occurred was murder, he had to undergo an inquest, but they forcibly removed the body so that they could have it under military control. They altered the body, they removed gun fragments, they falsified the x-rays, they faked autopsy photographs, they massively edited the Zapruder film. I'll return to that. Yeah, it's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. Meanwhile, it was Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, where Johnson as president would be in the position to pardon anyone should anyone be caught. But there was implicit understanding that no one would ever be punished for their participation in the assassination of JFK. And where he would appoint J. Edgar Hoover, who was a personal friend of Lyndon Johnson. They were neighbors in Washington, D.C. Edgar was the godfather to one of Lyndon's daughters, where they both hated the Kennedys, would be in a position to cover it up, because Lyndon would appoint the FBI as the sole investigative authority for the assassination. In other words, the Warren Commission didn't have any independent authority to conduct an investigation, and it was stacked with shills who were going to guarantee that the commission did not unearth any facts about what had actually happened that were not planted deliberately to mislead. Now, when it comes to the motorcade, the motorcade route was changed from going straight up Main Street to get onto the Stemmons Freeway, which could have effortlessly been done, to create a right-hand turn from Main Street onto Houston, and then a 110-degree turn from Houston onto Elm Street. That was already a violation of Secret Service protocols, which do not permit a turn of greater than 90 degrees. So this was 110, no doubt, to slow down the motorcade in a way that would not be overtly suspicious. But the driver, William Greer, swung out too widely and nearly hit a concrete abutment there, had to pause, hesitate, and get back into line. Although Abraham Zapruder reported that he began filming as soon as the motorcade came into view on Houston, and filmed continuously until it disappeared under the triple underpass, the extant version of the Zapruder film has a big gap from the motorcade beginning to turn onto Houston, and suddenly, poof, there you see the presidential limousine behind the Stemmons Freeway sign. They took out the whole turn because it would have made the American people very concerned about the safety the Secret Service was providing when the driver swung out too widely, had to hesitate, and then get back into line. So they took that out. Because the film was being recorded at about 18.3 frames per second, actually I believe it was 24, but the extant version is at 18.3, I calculate that took perhaps 5 seconds at nearly 20 frames per second, or 100 frames are taken out from the film at that point. The extant version we have today is 487 frames, but as I'm about to explain, more than half of the frames that ought to have been there in what should have originally been about 1,000 frames are missing for the reasons I'm now explaining. Jack was hit the first time by a shot in the back that was fired from the top of the county records building by a deputy sheriff by the name of Harry Weatherford, who was using a .30-06 to fire a Mannlicher Carcano bullet that had, it appears, actually been fired from the Mannlicher Carcano that would be planted as the weapon Lee Oswald had used into Jack's back. It was done using a plastic collar known as a sabot. The bullet only entered Jack's back about as deep as the second knuckle on your little finger, about 6 or 7 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. Jack was hit the second time by a shot fired from inside the triple underpass by an Air Force expert by the name of Jack Lawrence. Lawrence had gone to work for the automobile dealership that provided the vehicles for the presidential motorcade just a few days before. He returned there, all nauseated, muddy, apparently from making his escape through a sewer system beneath the Dealey Plaza that extends through Dallas, after having fired a shot using a special weapon of which there were only a small number, but where I believe the one he was using he'd actually been given by Curtis LeMay, who of course was the chief of staff of the Air Force, an extreme hawk who wanted to bomb Russia. You know, for him the invasion of Cuba would have been an appetizer in relation to the main course. So that appears to explain his presence there. Jack had suffered those 2 shots and also a miss by a Dallas police officer who was on the grassy knoll, a fellow by the name of Roscoe White, about whom more later, who is tied into the CIA. Roscoe was taking a shot with a pistol, and while it would have been the easiest shot, he would have hit Jackie. They were under strict orders that Jackie must not be harmed. So he pulled his shot slightly to the left, and the bullet wound up in the grass opposite the grassy knoll, what was removed from the dirt by a Dallas police lieutenant by the name of Day, who pocketed the bullet, which would never be seen again. Now, Jack was still alive. He'd been hit in the throat, he'd been hit in the back, but he was still alive. And we have what appears to have been a signal by an anti-Castro Cuban who is standing by the curbway, extending a fist, which is generally recognized as a motion to stop, and Greer pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt. Standing next to this man known as the Cuban was a fellow who was pumping a black umbrella up and down. It appears that was a signal visible to the shooters at all the locations that the target was still alive and you should keep firing. Greer pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt to make sure Jack would be killed. He was hit in the back of the head by a shot fired from the Dow Tex, the second floor, the window to a broom closet of a uranium mining company that was in fact a CIA asset, by an anti-Castro Cuban by the name of Nestor Tony Escadro, using an actual Mannlicher Carcano, which was the only unsilenced weapon used that day, to fire 3 shots to set up the acoustical impression that all 3 shots had been fired, where the weapon is so unreliable that 2 of the shots missed. One hit a distant curbing, and a fleck of concrete cut the cheek of a bystander standing there by the name of James Teague. The second barely missed Jack and hit the chrome strip over the windshield, but the third hit Jack in the back of the head, about the area of the external occipital protuberance, that bump at the back of your head where you recline if you were lying in a bathtub, for example. And he slumped forward. Jackie, not knowing what was going on, eased him back up and was viewing him, looking him right in the face, when he was hit in the right temple by a frangible or exploding bullet that shed up shockwaves that blew about half his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium, which hit Officer Bobby Hargis riding to the left rear with so much force that he initially thought he himself had been shot. That was fired by Frank Sturgis, who was a sort of a soldier of fortune. He'd worked for the CIA, sometimes for the mob. He may have been the best shot in the world at the time. In addition, then, there was a shooter at the opposite side of the book depository, namely Malcolm Mac Wallace, Lyndon's personal hitman, who was firing at John Connolly in the mistaken belief that it was Ralph Yarborough, a liberal Texas senator, whom LBJ despised. Lyndon had a huge argument with Jack that morning, trying to get Connolly, his dear friend, crony, and campaign manager, out of the vehicle, and Ralph Yarborough in, but Jack overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States. So here was Malcolm Mac Wallace, who was a very, very good shot, firing at John Connolly in the mistaken belief that it was Ralph Yarborough, which had the fascinating political consequence that no one would believe that Lyndon Johnson would ever have allowed his dear friend John Connolly to be placed in harm's way. You can see in photographs just before the motorcade, the grim visages of Lyndon Johnson and John Connolly, who himself knew he was going to be in the line of fire, but where it was too late to get the word to the shooters, and therefore he was going to have to play it out. So Connolly was actually hit anywhere from 1 to 3 times. He had a wound in the back that actually shattered a rib and exited his chest. He had a wound in his right wrist, and a bullet impacted in his left thigh, which the government would maintain was all caused by the same shot, to wit that it hit Jack Kennedy in the back, except that was totally implausible given where Jack was hit in the back was 6 to 7 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. So Gerald Ford, who was then a member of the commission, changed the description of the wound to the back from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of the neck, which was an overt falsification, so that the government could claim that the bullet that entered the back of Jack's neck had passed through his neck and exited his throat, thereby accounting for the shot to the throat, gone into Conley's back, shattered the rib, exited, hit his right wrist, and wound up in his left thigh, all of which was complete and total poppycock. It was all manufactured, totally fake, indeed. David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, where David has both a PhD in physics from Wisconsin and an MD from Michigan, and is board certified in radiation oncology, which is a treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions to JFK and plotted the official trajectory of the alleged entry point to the alleged exit point, and found it's not even an anatomically possible trajectory because cervical vertebrae intervene, which explains why Arlen Specter, when he was questioning Dr. Malcolm Perry, MD, who'd performed a simple tracheostomy incision in the throat wound and who had described it 3 times during the Parkland press conference held after the death of the president was announced, that it was a wound of entry, was asked to assume, hypothetically, if the bullet had hit here at the back of the neck, passed through the neck without hitting any bony structures, exited the throat, would that be consistent with describing the throat wound as a wound of exit? To which he obligingly answered yes, it would be, but that he was not in the position to vouch for or verify the assumptions he'd been asked to make, which of course were false. I mean, it was nonsense. But this is how Malcolm Perry was manipulated into supporting the official position, even though he knew up close and personal it was bullshit. Complete and total bullshit. So, after Jack was hit in the right temple, he slumped to the left. Jackie, observing a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains on the trunk, crawled out to fetch them, which she held in her hand all the way to Parkland. Meanwhile, Clint Hill, who was Jackie's bodyguard, rushed up from the Secret Service limousine to push Jackie back in the vehicle and laid down over their bodies, and was the first to observe this fist-sized blow-up to the back of the head in JFK's cranium, which he would describe consistently for 50 years. In fact, Clint Hill's description of that wound even made it into a book entitled The Kennedy Detail, about the Secret Service performance in Dallas, even though that single observation by itself refutes the official account, showing there had been at least one shot from in front, actually from the right front, that had caused that massive defect to the back of the head. In passing, they would actually cover it up. They would falsify the x-rays. David Mantic would enter the National Archives for the first time in late 1992, after we had linked up and were going to be collaborating on a long article or a book, where that would be the first of 3 books to which David Mantic would make very major contributions, namely Assassination Science 1998, Murder at Dealey Plaza 2000, and The Great Zapruder Film Hoax 2003, where I've subsequently published a more recent volume, JFK, Who, How, and Why, with Moonrock Books, which includes the new research by Larry Rivero and other results of his research especially, which I'm about to describe now. Larry recovered interviews with the 4 motorcycle escort officers and their supervisor, Stavis Ellis, that had been recorded by an early student of JFK and transcribed them, and discovered that a whole host of events took place after the driver pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt, including that Officer Hargis parked his bike, ran between the Secret Service limousine and the presidential, which would have been impossible had they been in motion, had they not been stationary, up to the grassy knoll from which he believed shots had been fired. Officer Douglas Jackson on the right motored his bike up the grassy knoll. We have photographs where you can see the furrows it created until his bike fell over, and then he proceeded on foot, also because he believed shots had been fired from the grassy knoll. Meanwhile, 5 Secret Service agents dismounted the Secret Service limousine and surrounded the presidential, one of whom took a chunk from a little boy and threw it in the back seat. Now, while I initially believed the limo stop had only been 6 to 8 seconds long, I've been unable to reconcile all of these activities with a time frame of less than 20 seconds. So if you have 20 seconds at 20 frames per second, we're talking about another 400 frames that were removed from the film. They had to exclude these obvious indications of the true cause of death of the president because they were so telling of Secret Service complicity in the event. So when they edited the film, they took out way too many frames. Instead of Jack slumping to the left, they sought to merge the double hit, the hit to the back of the head where Jack slumped forward and Jackie eased him back up, and then where he slumped to the left after having been hit in the right temple, so that you had this violent back and to the left motion, which was not a part of the original sequence of events, but an artifact from the editing of the film. They actually, this had happened over the weekend, by the way, where the Zapruder film was taken to a local Kodak lab and an original and 3 copies were made. Actually, it appears even a 4th copy, which was sold to H.L. Hunt for $100,000, it appears. He was very prominent among the Texas oilmen. He'd handed out a wanted for treason flyer for JFK that morning. And he wanted to have his own personal copy. But the Secret Service got a copy of the film back to the to the Secret Service laboratory, a secret photo lab they had in Rochester, New York, known as Hawkeye Works, adjacent to Kodak headquarters, where the original, one of the original copies was taken directly to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, where one crew was working and where they created a board to identify the various shots, the impact of the various bullets, with one team of workers, but where Sunday, a Secret Service agent who identified himself as William Smith brought the substitute. And we know the differences are quite substantial. The way the camera works, it uses a 16 millimeter slice of film, but does shoot one 8 millimeter image down one side. You have to take it out, flip it over, and then shoot the other 8 millimeter separate side. So you have sides in A and B. If you want to run the whole thing together as a continuous film, then you have to have them developed, split, and spliced together. The film that was brought to the NPIC on Saturday was an 8 millimeter already split film developed in Dallas. The substitute, with all the editing that was brought to the NPIC on Sunday, had been developed in Rochester and was an unsplit 16 millimeter film. So there's no doubt about when the substitution was made. It's a truly fascinating history. I have a lot about it in, of course, the Great Zapruder Film Hoax, a third of my 3 original books, which shattered the cover-up. It's crucial in doing research on these events that you sort out the authentic from the inauthentic evidence, just as we did with Sandy Hook, discovering how much of the evidence that was being presented was actually from a FEMA exercise, and that the death certificates were fabricated, and other phony evidence like the photographs of the deceased children, which were in fact fictions made up of photographs of older children when they were younger. In the case of JFK, David Manning, who's an expert in the interpretation of X-rays, told me before he entered the National Archives the first time in late 1992 that he thought he'd find evidence of a second shot to the head, which indeed he did. Metallic particles from that frangible or exploding bullet, but also evidence the X-rays had been altered, which indeed he did. He applied a technique from physics known as optical depth cytometry, whereby you measure the amount of light that passes through an X-ray, and you can calculate the relative density of the objects whose exposure to radiation created the images. And he discovered that there had been a patch had been imposed of material that was much too dense to be human bone, that very closely corresponded to diagrams we had of the wound from doctors, including Robert McClellan, of this very ugly blowout to the back of the head, and Charles Crenshaw, MD, who actually drew the blowout to the back of the head from the back and from the side for me, for my book, Assassination Science, and also of the wound to the throat before and after the tracheostomy, from which it becomes obvious that they greatly enlarged the tracheostomy wound, which was a small, clean puncture wound with a straight incision at Bethesda, and believe it or not, where James Humes, who was in charge of the autopsy at Bethesda, actually took a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and greatly enlarged the fist-sized blowout to make it appear to be more consistent with a wound fired from behind if the president had been leaning well forward. But he did it in front of two witnesses, one of whom, Thomas Evan Robinson, prepared the body for burial, and who explained to the Assassination Records Review Board when they deposed him that the dotted line, which indicated this much larger wound had been created by the physicians, but where you find it described with mathematical detail in the Bethesda autopsy report, stunning. So that we know what was done. We have determined that the brain shown in diagrams and photographs at the National Archives is not even the brain of JFK. I could have drawn that conclusion since it's a virtually intact brain with only minor damage at the top, with a completely intact cerebellum, and yet the physicians, one after another at Parkland, had described extruding cerebellar as well as cerebral brain tissue, where the cerebellum is a compact part of the brain just above the brain stem. I could have drawn that conclusion, but in this instance it was drawn by a world authority on the human brain, Bob Livingston, MD, who created the first department of neuroscience in the world at the University of California, San Diego, and was also an expert on wounds and ballistics, having supervised an emergency medical hospital for injured POWs and Okinawans during the Battle of Okinawa. It occurred to me that they spent so much time blacking out the blowout to the back of the head that they might have overlooked it was visible in later frames that I found in frame 374. You can actually see the blowout at the back of the head, and that it corresponds to David's optical densitometry studies, rather the shape of a cashew on its side, and confirms what we know, meaning the Zapruder film itself is not even internally consistent. You can pick up that book at moonrockbooks.com, or if you want a video introduction that covers virtually everything I've been covering here, you can find it on BitChute. JFK, who was responsible and why, with Brian Rue, R-U-H-E, JFK, who was responsible and why. You can download it yourself to your desktop and understand what happened to our country. That was one of the great false flags of history to divert attention from the monstrous conspiracy that took place here. And of course, we find it repeated again and again, 9/11. I'd be glad to return on another occasion and review what we know about that phony, contrived event, staged real deaths, real explosions, but conducted by the CIA, the neocons, and the Department of Defense and the Mossad, and then the whole series of additional events, Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, Orlando, Dallas, Parkland, Charlottesville, where I have books on all of those, which have been banned by Amazon.com, but which you can still find at moonrockbooks.com. I can't thank you enough for giving me this opportunity to share this with you today here on your show. And just know I'll be glad to return again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fetzer. As always, it's a pleasure. Is there any last updates or words or remarks that you want to mention?
Well, I'll just say, if anyone believes in freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom, to publish, if you wanted to support me, you can go to jamesfetzer.com, and you can find different ways to contribute, one of which may be to write directly to me. You can send a check or a money order to me if you're up for supporting my effort to set this absurd verdict straight. None of the money is going to offset the $450,000, but rather to support my appeal and the lawsuit that will follow, which I expect to happen, where I have the opportunity to have the trial I was denied by the summary judgment and set the record straight for the benefit of the American public. Any of you who take that route, please know you'll receive a formal acknowledgement for me expressing my profound appreciation. And once again, I thank you for this opportunity to join you here today.
Thank you, Mr. Fetzer. Please keep in touch, and we'll all be updating each other on what's going on.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take care.